Caesar, Life of a Colossus by Adrian Goldsworthy. Picture this. You're 25, born into a noble family that's heavy on prestige but light on cash. You're smart, ambitious, and somewhere deep down, you just know you're meant for something extraordinary. But right now, you've got a problem. You're on a small ship bobbing in the Mediterranean, and on the horizon, those dark sails cutting through the water, pirates. Your ship gets captured. You and your traveling companions become hostages. These pirates, rough as they come, demand 20 talents of silver for your life. That's serious money, enough to set someone up for life. Your companions are terrified, naturally. But you actually laugh. You look the pirate captain dead in the eye and tell him 20 talents is insulting. You're worth way more than that. Make it 50. The pirates are stunned at first. Then they start laughing at your nerve. For the next 38 days you live among them, not cowering like a prisoner, but acting like you own the place. You join their games, write poetry and speeches, and perform them out loud. When they don't applaud enthusiastically enough, you call them illiterate barbarians to their faces. And then, with a smile that could charm or chill, you casually mention that once you're free, you'll come back and have every single one of them crucified. They think it's hilarious, just the bravado of an arrogant young nobleman. Eventually, your people return with the 50 talents. The ransom gets paid. You're free. But you don't just go home and thank the gods. Instead, you head to the nearest port, gather a small fleet, and somehow convince enough sailors to follow you back to that pirate island. You catch them completely off guard, capture the lot of them, and recover your 50 talents. And then, you keep your promise. Every single pirate gets crucified. That young man was Gaius Julius Caesar, and that one story tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the person who would eventually hold the entire known world in his hands. It's a story of breathtaking boldness, unshakable confidence, magnetic charm, and ice-cold ruthlessness, all rolled into one. Today we're diving deep into what many consider the definitive biography of this extraordinary figure, Caesar, Life of a Colossus, by Adrian Goldsworthy. This isn't just another history book collecting dust on academic shelves. It's a monumental work that's captivated scholars and everyday readers alike, selling hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide. Goldsworthy, a brilliant historian with a gift for storytelling, doesn't just recite facts and dates. He paints a vivid, living portrait of a man and the chaotic, dangerous world that shaped him. By the time we finish this journey, you won't just know the story of a Roman general. You'll understand timeless principles of power, the anatomy of world-changing ambition, and the profound, often brutal price of reshaping history. You'll see how someone can be a fugitive one day and worshipped as a god the next, and how the echoes of his choices still reverberate through our world 2,000 years later. This is more than a history lesson. It's a masterclass in human nature at its most brilliant and its most terrifying. To really understand someone like Caesar, you need to understand the world he was born into. And Rome, at the dawn of the 1st century BC, was a world of chaos, contradiction, and cutthroat competition. Rome had conquered the known world, stretching from Spain to Asia Minor, but it hadn't figured out how to govern itself. The system was breaking. It was a society where old virtues of duty and honor were colliding violently with staggering new wealth and naked personal ambition. For centuries, Rome had been guided by one deep primal fear: kings. Power was supposed to be shared and temporary. 2 consuls, the highest leaders, were elected each year and couldn't be re-elected for a decade. The Senate, about 300 of the Republic's most powerful men, guided the state. Everything was built on this delicate balance of competition. You climbed the ladder of offices, the cursus honorum, gaining influence, or what Romans called auctoritas, a combination of reputation, prestige, and the sheer weight of who you were. But the golden rule was that no single person should ever be allowed to rise too far above everyone else. Yet this system was tearing itself apart. Before Caesar was even born, political disputes had started ending in blood. Reformers like the Gracchi brothers tried to help the poor and got clubbed to death in the streets by their political opponents. Then came the towering figures of Marius and Sulla. Marius, a brilliant general and Caesar's uncle by marriage, was a new man, the first in his family to reach the top. He saved Rome from invading barbarian tribes, but bent all the rules to do it, holding the consulship 5 years running, which was completely illegal. His rival, Sulla, was an aristocrat who felt blocked at every turn. When the Senate tried to take away his military command and give it to Marius, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his own Roman legions on Rome itself. This was the world of Caesar's youth, a world where the old rules were dying and power was becoming something you seized, not something you were granted. Civil war erupted. Lists of political enemies got posted in the forum, and anyone could kill someone on the list and claim a reward. Husbands were butchered in front of their wives, sons in front of their mothers. This wasn't a stable, orderly society. It was a blood-soaked arena, and only the most ruthless and ambitious could survive. Into this storm, in the year 100 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was born. His family, the Julii, were patricians, part of Rome's oldest aristocracy. They had a proud name, even claiming direct descent from the goddess Venus herself. But in the brutal world of Roman politics, a famous name wasn't enough. They were a family with more ancestry than actual influence, living in the Subura, an unfashionable, crowded, noisy district far from the grand mansions of the truly powerful. From the very beginning, Caesar was shaped by two powerful forces: his formidable mother, Aurelia, and his connection to the great Marius. Aurelia was a classic Roman matron who instilled in her only son a powerful sense of his own worth and destiny. But it was his aunt's marriage to Marius that tied the family to one of the most powerful and controversial men in Rome. This connection nearly cost him his life. When Sulla finally won the civil war and became dictator of Rome, he began systematically eliminating anyone associated with Marius. Caesar was just a teenager, barely 16, but he was on Sulla's radar. He was married to Cornelia, the daughter of Sulla's chief enemy, Cinna. Sulla, the most powerful man in the world, gave the boy a simple command: divorce your wife. It was a test of loyalty. Other young men, including the rising star Pompey, had obeyed similar orders without question. But Caesar refused. Think about that for a moment. A teenager with no power, no army, and a family on the losing side of a brutal war looked the dictator in the eye and said no. Why? Maybe it was love for Cornelia. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was an early sign of that unshakable self-belief, the conviction that the rules applying to other men simply didn't apply to him. Sulla was furious. He stripped Caesar of his wife's dowry and his inheritance. He marked him for death. Caesar was forced to flee Rome, becoming a fugitive, moving from safe house to safe house every night, sick with malaria. One night, he was captured by a patrol of Sulla's soldiers. His life was over, but Caesar, ever the pragmatist, did the only thing he could. He bribed the patrol's commander and bought his freedom. Eventually, powerful relatives, including his mother Aurelia, pleaded for his life, and Sulla reluctantly pardoned him, but he did so with a chilling prophecy. Looking at this ambitious, defiant young man, Sulla warned his followers to be wary, for, in this Caesar there are many Mariuses. He saw in him the seeds of revolutionary ambition that could one day destroy them all. With Sulla still in power, Rome was no place for him. Caesar went abroad for his military service, the first step for any aspiring politician. In Asia, he quickly distinguished himself, winning the Corona Civica, or civic crown, Rome's highest award for bravery, given for saving a fellow citizen's life in battle. He was proving himself a natural soldier. But his time in the East also gave his enemies their first great weapon against him. He was sent as an envoy to the court of King Nicomedes of Bithynia. Caesar, young and perhaps naive, lingered far longer than necessary in the luxurious royal court. Soon, ugly rumors began spreading. The gossip was that the old king had seduced the handsome young Roman, and that Caesar had willingly become his lover. In the hyper-masculine world of Roman politics, this was devastating. To be the passive partner in a homosexual relationship was seen as deeply shameful, a mark of weakness considered unfit even for a slave, let alone a Roman aristocrat. Whether it was true didn't matter. It was a story his enemies would weaponize for the rest of his life, dubbing him the quote of Bithynia. It was his first hard lesson in the politics of personal destruction. This may have been one reason Caesar became such a notorious womanizer. He embarked on a lifetime of affairs, seducing the wives of Rome's most powerful men, including the wives of his future political partners, Pompey and Crassus. But one affair stood apart: his long, passionate relationship with Servilia, the half-sister of his greatest political enemy, Cato the Younger, and mother of another famous Roman, Marcus Brutus. This was a love that lasted decades, a deep bond between two intelligent, ambitious people who understood the game of power. When Sulla finally died, Caesar returned to Rome, ready to begin his climb. But he had a problem: no money. Political careers in Rome were ruinously expensive. To win favor with the people, you had to stage lavish games, fund public works, and essentially buy your way into office. Caesar spent money he didn't have with reckless abandon. Before he'd even held a major office, he was over 1,300 talents in debt, a truly astronomical sum. He was gambling everything on his future success. As aedile, the magistrate in charge of public games, he put on the most spectacular gladiatorial shows Rome had ever seen, equipping 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor. The people loved him for it. But his rivals saw a dangerous demagogue, a man buying popularity with borrowed money. At the same time, he skillfully reminded Rome of his connection to the great hero Marius, whose memory Sulla had tried to erase. At his Aunt Julia's funeral, he paraded images of Marius's victories, a defiant act wildly popular with the public. He was playing a dangerous game, aligning himself with common people against the conservative elite of the Senate. The next step in his gamble was running for Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. It was a position of immense prestige, usually held by a distinguished elder statesman. Caesar was only in his 30s, and running against two of the most respected ex-consuls in Rome, including his old enemy, Catulus. It was audacious. His rivals were so certain he couldn't win that Catulus offered Caesar a massive bribe just to withdraw and avoid the humiliation of defeat. Caesar's response? He took the offer as a sign of weakness, borrowed even more money, and poured it into his campaign. On the morning of the election, he kissed his mother Aurelia goodbye and told her, "Today I will return as Pontifex Maximus, or I will not return at all. He won by a landslide. Caesar was a rising star, but the Roman universe was already dominated by two giants, Pompey the Great and Marcus Crassus. Pompey was the military hero, the man who'd won victories on 3 continents and was adored by the people. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, a shrewd political operator who held the debts of half the Senate. Both were powerful, but they despised each other, and both were being frustrated by a small, powerful group of conservative senators, led by the stubbornly principled Cato the Younger. This is where Caesar showed his political genius. He saw that, while he was weaker than either Pompey or Crassus individually, he could become the indispensable link between them. He secretly approached them and forged an informal alliance that history would call the First Triumvirate. Caesar promised to use his upcoming term as consul to pass the laws they wanted: land for Pompey's veterans and financial breaks for Crassus's business associates. In return, they'd use their immense influence to back him. It was a pact that would shatter the foundations of the Republic. His year as consul in 59 BC was a political firestorm. His co-consul, Bibulus, was a pawn of Cato and the conservatives, and tried to block Caesar at every turn. When Caesar presented a popular land reform bill to the Senate, Cato tried to talk it to death, speaking for hours until Caesar, losing his temper, had him arrested. When Bibulus tried to declare the omens unfavorable, a traditional way to stop all public business, Caesar simply ignored him and took his law directly to the people. Bibulus and his supporters were driven from the forum by force, with a basket of dung dumped on Bibulus's head for good measure. For the rest of the year, Bibulus locked himself in his house, effectively leaving Caesar as sole ruler of Rome. People joked that it was the quote, 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 and Caesar. Caesar had gotten what he wanted, but he'd made powerful, unforgiving enemies. He knew that the moment he stepped down from office, he'd be prosecuted, and his career destroyed. He needed a military command, a big one, that would grant him legal immunity for years, and give him the chance to win the glory and the money he needed to secure his position. The Triumvirate delivered. He was granted a 5-year command over 3 provinces, including Gaul. He was 41 years old. He'd spent his life navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics. Now he was about to step onto a new stage, and in the forests and fields of Gaul, he would transform himself from a controversial politician into one of the greatest military commanders in human history. When Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC, he commanded 4 legions. By the time he left, he'd command an army more than twice that size, forged in battle and fanatically loyal to him personally. For 8 years, Gaul became his world, a brutal theater of war and conquest. His own writings, the commentaries on the Gallic War, tell the story. Written in a stark, simple style, they're a masterpiece of political propaganda, portraying his every action as necessary defense of Rome and its allies. But beneath the polished prose lies a story of relentless, systematic conquest. His first challenge came almost immediately. The Helvetii, a large tribal nation from modern-day Switzerland, were on the move, migrating across Gaul in a vast column of over 300,000 people. They wanted to pass through Roman territory. Caesar saw a threat and an opportunity. He refused them passage, built a massive fortification to block them, then pursued them when they took another route. He caught a quarter of their people at the river Saone and massacred them. The rest he brought to battle and crushed. Of the 368,000 who'd set out, he claims only 110,000 were sent back to their homes. No sooner was this great war over than another began. A coalition of Gallic tribes begged him for help against a fearsome German king, Ariovistus, who'd crossed the Rhine and was terrorizing their lands. Caesar's own troops were terrified at the prospect of fighting the Germans, whose size and ferocity were legendary. Panic swept through the camp. Caesar called a council of his officers, not to ask their opinion, but to shame them. He told them he'd march against the enemy with only his favorite 10th Legion if he had to, for he had no doubt of its loyalty. His speech worked. Shamed into obedience, the army followed him. He met and utterly destroyed Ariovistus's army, driving the Germans back across the Rhine. In just one summer, he defeated two of the most powerful forces in Gaul. But he was just beginning. The following year, 57 BC, he turned his attention to the Belgae, the tribes of northern Gaul, whom he called the bravest of all. A massive confederation of tribes had gathered to oppose him. He met them at the river Sambre. The battle was one of the most desperate of his career. His army was caught by surprise while building its camp. The Roman line was nearly broken. At the critical moment, with two of his legions on the verge of collapse, Caesar grabbed a shield from a soldier in the rear ranks and plunged into the front line himself. He called on his centurions by name, rallied the men, and fought among them. His personal courage saved the day. The arrival of reinforcements turned the tide, and another great victory was won. With each victory, his ambition grew. He wasn't just defending Rome's borders anymore. He was conquering a new empire. In 55 BC, he did two things no Roman commander had ever done before. First, he bridged the Rhine in just 10 days, a staggering feat of engineering, and led his army into Germany for a brief punitive expedition. Then, late in the summer, he gathered a small fleet and launched an expedition to an island shrouded in myth and mystery, Britain. Both of his British expeditions, one in 55 BC and a larger one in 54 BC, were more reconnaissance missions than full-scale invasions. They were logistical nightmares. His fleet was battered by storms, and the Britons, with their terrifying war chariots, proved fierce opponents. He won some skirmishes, took some hostages, and left. Militarily, he accomplished very little. But in terms of propaganda, the invasions were spectacular. The people of Rome were electrified. Caesar had led their legions across the ocean, to the very edge of the known world. The Senate voted him an unprecedented 20 days of public thanksgiving. But while Caesar was winning glory abroad, the situation in Gaul was becoming dangerously unstable. His constant presence, the demand for grain, and his interference in tribal politics were breeding deep resentment. In the winter of 54 BC, that resentment exploded. A legion and a half, some 7,000 men, under the command of his officers Sabinus and Cotta, were ambushed and annihilated by the Eburones tribe, led by a cunning chieftain named Ambiorix. It was a devastating defeat, the worst Caesar had suffered. The rebels then immediately besieged another legion commanded by Quintus Cicero, brother of the famous orator. Caesar was miles away when he heard the news. With just 2 legions, numbering no more than 7,000 men, he force-marched to the rescue. He was hugely outnumbered, but he tricked the Gallic army into attacking him on favorable ground, and, in a brilliant defensive battle, routed them and relieved Cicero's camp. The rebellion was far from over. The defeat had shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. In 52 BC, Gaul rose in a massive, unified revolt, led by a young, charismatic nobleman of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was a new kind of opponent. He was intelligent, disciplined, and understood that he couldn't defeat the legions in a pitched battle. He united the tribes and implemented a brutal but effective scorched earth strategy burning his own people's towns and farms to deny Caesar's army supplies. For the first time, Caesar was on the defensive, his army hungry and harassed. He besieged the great town of Avaricum, and after a grueling 27-day siege, his frustrated soldiers stormed the walls and massacred the 40,000 inhabitants. But the victory was hollow. Caesar then marched on Gergovia, Vercingetorix's home fortress. Here, Caesar suffered his second great defeat. A premature assault on the town was repulsed with heavy losses, including 46 of his veteran centurions. His army was forced to retreat. Morale was low. The rebellion was gaining momentum, and even his staunchest allies, the Aedui, defected. Caesar was trapped deep in hostile territory, his supply lines cut. It seemed as if his Gallic adventure was about to end in disaster. But it was in this moment of supreme crisis that he showed his true genius. He regrouped his forces, joining up with the 4 legions under his best subordinate, Labienus. Vercingetorix, overconfident after his victory, decided to risk an attack on Caesar's army on the march. It was a fatal mistake. Caesar's cavalry, reinforced by elite German horsemen, shattered the Gallic attack. Vercingetorix retreated with his 80,000-man army to the hilltop fortress of Alesia. What followed was one of the greatest sieges in history. Caesar arrived and, seeing that a direct assault was impossible, decided to starve the enemy out. His 10 legions, some 40,000 men, began constructing a massive line of fortifications, a wall, ditch, and towers, 11 miles long, completely encircling the town of Alesia. But Vercingetorix had managed to send his cavalry away before the ring was closed, with orders to summon a massive relief army from all over Gaul. Caesar knew they were coming, and so he ordered his men to build a second line of fortifications, even larger than the first, facing outward. His army was now besieged itself, sandwiched between Vercingetorix's army inside the walls and a colossal Gallic relief army on the outside. Soon, that army arrived, a force Caesar claims numbered over 250,000 warriors. The final battle for Gaul had begun. The Gauls launched a series of massive, coordinated assaults on both the inner and outer lines. The fighting raged for days. On the final day, the Gauls concentrated their attack on a weak point in the Roman outer line. The legionaries there were on the verge of breaking. Caesar, watching from a command post, sent in reinforcements, first under Labienus, then rode there himself, his famous scarlet cloak making him visible to both friend and foe. He led the final desperate counterattack in person. At the same time, he sent his German cavalry on a wide flanking maneuver to strike the Gauls in the rear. The surprise was total. The Gallic relief army broke and fled. Seeing the disaster from the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix knew the cause was lost. The next day, the great Gaulish war leader rode out in his finest armor, surrendered his weapons at Caesar's feet, and gave himself up. The great revolt was over. After 8 years of brutal warfare, all of Gaul had been conquered. The conquest had made Caesar fabulously wealthy and had given him a large, battle-hardened, and fanatically loyal army. But back in Rome, the political world had shifted dramatically. Crassus had been killed in a disastrous invasion of Parthia. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had died in childbirth. The personal bonds holding the triumvirate together were gone. Pompey, increasingly jealous of Caesar's success and alarmed by his power, had drifted back into the camp of the conservative senators, Caesar's sworn enemies. The final confrontation was brewing. Caesar's command in Gaul was coming to an end. and his enemies, led by Cato, were determined to prosecute him for his illegal actions as consul as soon as he became a private citizen. Caesar's only hope was to move directly from his military command to a second consulship, which would give him another year of legal immunity. He secured a law allowing him to stand for election without being present in Rome. But his opponents, now with Pompey on their side, were determined to block him. They demanded he give up his army before the election. For months, a tense political chess match played out. Caesar offered compromises. He'd give up most of his provinces and his army, as long as Pompey did the same. Pompey, confident in his position and pressured by the hardliners, refused. The Senate, now dominated by Caesar's enemies, passed its, quote, ultimate decree, effectively declaring a state of emergency and ordering Caesar to disband his army, or be declared an enemy of the state. Two tribunes loyal to Caesar, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, vetoed the motion but were threatened with violence and forced to flee Rome. Caesar was at Ravenna, with only a single legion, when he heard the news. He'd been backed into a corner. To give up his army now would mean political ruin and likely exile or death. To keep it would mean civil war. He gathered his soldiers and presented his case, portraying himself as the defender of the rights of the tribunes and the victim of a hostile political faction. Then, on the night of January 10, 49 BC, he led his men to a small river that marked the boundary of his province, the Rubicon. He knew that to cross it with an army was an act of treason, an irrevocable declaration of war against the state. For a moment he paused on the bank, contemplating the magnitude of his decision. Then he spoke the famous words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. He crossed the river. The civil war had begun. Caesar's opponents, with Pompey at their head, had vastly superior resources, more legions, complete control of the navy, and the wealth of the eastern provinces. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They underestimated Caesar's speed, expecting him to gather his full army before advancing. They were stunned when he launched a winter blitz down through Italy with just his single legion. Town after town opened its gates to him. There was no popular support for the Senate's war. Instead of the brutal conqueror they expected, Caesar showed remarkable clemency, pardoning and releasing any enemy soldiers and senators he captured. His most bitter enemy, Domitius Ahenobarbus, was captured at Corfinium with 30 cohorts. Caesar let him go free. Pompey, realizing he couldn't defend Italy, evacuated his forces and the majority of the Senate across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, planning to build a massive army to retake Italy later. In just 60 days, without a single major battle, Caesar had become master of Italy. But the war was far from over. Pompey's best legions were in Spain. Caesar famously declared he was going to Spain to fight an army without a general, and would then return to fight a general without an army. After a brilliant and complex campaign of maneuver at Ilerda, he surrounded and forced the surrender of the entire Pompeian army in Spain. Now he was ready for Pompey. In early 48 BC, he gathered his forces and, dodging the enemy's naval blockade, managed to ship his army across to Greece. For months, the two greatest generals of the age faced each other in a tense standoff near the coastal city of Dyrrhachium. Caesar, outnumbered, tried to besiege Pompey's larger army, building another massive line of fortifications. But this time, his gamble failed. Pompey broke through his lines, inflicting a sharp defeat on Caesar's army. It was a serious blow. Caesar's aura of invincibility was broken. Pompey's senior officers were ecstatic, convinced the war was all but won. They urged him to finish Caesar off. Pompey was more cautious, preferring to wear Caesar down by cutting off his supplies. But the pressure from the arrogant nobles in his camp was immense. he finally relented and followed Caesar inland to the plains of Pharsalus. On August 9, 48 BC, the decisive battle was fought. Pompey had a massive advantage, with over 45,000 infantry to Caesar's 22,000, and a cavalry force that outnumbered Caesar's 7-1. Pompey's plan was simple. His superior cavalry would smash Caesar's right flank and then envelop his legions from the rear. Caesar anticipated the move. In a stroke of tactical genius, he secretly created a fourth line of his best infantry cohorts and hid them behind his cavalry on the right wing. As the battle began, Pompey's cavalry charged, driving back Caesar's horsemen as expected. But just as they were about to swing into the rear of the legions, Caesar gave the signal. His hidden fourth line charged forward, not throwing their javelins, but using them as stabbing spears, aimed at the faces of the enemy horsemen. The tactic was brutal and terrifyingly effective. Pompey's elite cavalry, thrown into panic, broke and fled the field. Caesar's fourth line then wheeled and crashed into the exposed flank of Pompey's legions. At the same time, Caesar committed his fresh third-line reserves into the main battle. The Pompeian line shattered. The victory was total and overwhelming. Pompey, seeing the battle was lost, fled the field, a broken man. He made his way to Egypt, seeking refuge, but the advisors to the young King Ptolemy XIII decided it was safer to curry favor with the victor. As Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death and beheaded. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later, he was presented with Pompey's head and signet ring. He's said to have wept. The war, he may have thought, was finally over. But his stay in Egypt would draw him into another conflict, and into the arms of one of history's most famous women. Egypt was in the midst of its own civil war between the young King Ptolemy and his brilliant, ambitious older sister, Cleopatra. Seeing her chance, the 21-year-old queen had herself smuggled through the enemy lines and into the palace where Caesar was staying, famously arriving rolled up in a rug, or, more likely, a laundry bag. Caesar, then 52, was captivated. They became lovers, and he decided to back her claim to the throne. This sparked the Alexandrian War, a vicious, confusing conflict fought in the streets of the great city. Caesar, with only 4,000 men, was besieged and nearly defeated, at one point having to swim for his life to escape a sinking boat. But reinforcements eventually arrived, and he crushed the Egyptian army. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, and Caesar installed Cleopatra as sole ruler of Egypt. He lingered in Egypt for months, enjoying a leisurely cruise down the Nile with the queen. By the time he left, Cleopatra was pregnant with his child, a son she would name Caesarion. The war, however, was not over. The remaining Pompeian leaders, Cato, Scipio, and Labienus, had gathered a massive army in Africa. In 46 BC, Caesar pursued them. After a difficult campaign, he brought them to battle at Thapsus and annihilated their forces. The aftermath was a tragedy of republican ideals. Cato, the unwavering defender of the old ways, committed suicide at Utica, rather than accept a pardon from the man he considered a tyrant. After celebrating 4 magnificent triumphs in Rome, Caesar had to fight one last brutal campaign in Spain against Pompey's sons. At the Battle of Munda in 45 BC, he faced his toughest fight. His veteran legions were pushed to the brink of defeat, and Caesar later said that he'd often fought for victory, but at Munda he fought for his life. He won. The civil war was finally over. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate showered him with honors, naming him dictator for life. He was now, in all but name, a king. And he ruled well. he embarked on a breathtaking program of reform. He revised the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor adjustments, we still use today. He settled his veterans, and tens of thousands of Rome's poor, in new colonies across the empire. He reformed the administration of the provinces, expanded the Senate, and began massive public works projects in Rome. Most importantly, he continued his policy of clemency, pardoning his former enemies, men like Brutus and Cassius, and giving them positions of honor. He seemed to believe that his generosity and the obvious benefits of his rule would be enough to win over the old aristocracy. He was wrong. To many senators, his absolute power was an intolerable affront to the traditions of the Republic. They saw him not as a savior, but as a tyrant who destroyed their liberty. And so, a conspiracy was formed, led by the very men he'd pardoned. The leaders were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter and pragmatic former Pompeian, and Marcus Junius Brutus, Servilius' son, a man torn between his affection for Caesar and his duty to his idealized vision of the Republic. More than 60 senators joined the plot. Caesar was warned. He knew there were plots, but he dismissed his bodyguard, saying he'd rather die than live in fear. He was planning one last great campaign, a 3-year war against Parthia to avenge Crassus. He was scheduled to leave on March 18th. The conspirators knew they had to act before he left. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar went to a meeting of the Senate held in a hall next to Pompey's theater. As he sat on his gilded chair, the conspirators crowded around him, pretending to present a petition. One of them, Tullius Cimber, grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulders. It was the signal. Casca struck the first blow from behind. Caesar fought back, but he was surrounded. One by one, the assassins lunged with their daggers. He was stabbed 23 times. As he saw Brutus, the man he'd loved like a son, approach with his weapon drawn, he said to have uttered his last words, "You too, my child?" Then he pulled his toga over his head and fell at the base of his great rival Pompey's statue, bleeding to death on the floor of the Senate. The assassins had killed Caesar, but they hadn't killed his legacy. They believed they'd restored the Republic, but they'd only plunged it into another, more terrible cycle of civil war. Caesar's friend, Mark Antony, and his adopted heir, the young Octavian, would hunt them down and destroy them. And out of the ashes of that final conflict, the Republic would be gone forever, replaced by the Roman Empire, ruled by Caesar's ultimate successor, Augustus. What are we to make of this man, Gaius Julius Caesar? For 2,000 years his story has captivated us, and for good reason. He was a walking paradox, a brilliant general who could be merciful to his enemies, a populist leader who lived like a king, a reformer who destroyed the very system he sought to improve. Was he a hero or a villain, a savior or a tyrant? Adrian Goldsworthy's masterful biography, Life of a Colossus, doesn't give us an easy answer. Instead, it shows us a man who was a product of his time, a time of intense, brutal competition, where the rules of the old republic were breaking down. Caesar didn't create that world, but he was uniquely equipped to master it. He possessed a rare combination of charisma, intelligence, audacity, and an almost superhuman will to succeed. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in a crumbling system, power isn't given, it's taken. One of the most powerful lessons from his life is the importance of decisive action. Caesar never waited. When he saw the Helvetii on the move, he marched. When his enemies in the Senate tried to corner him, he crossed the Rubicon. He understood that hesitation is often the greatest risk of all. He gambled again and again, but his gambles were backed by meticulous preparation and an unshakable belief in his own destiny or what he called his fortuna. It's a powerful reminder that while we can't control everything, we can choose to act with courage in the face of uncertainty. But perhaps the most surprising lesson from Caesar's life is his strategic use of clemency. In an age of bloody proscriptions and vengeance, he chose to pardon his enemies. At Corfinium, at Pharsalus, he let thousands of his opponents go free. This wasn't just kindness. It was a brilliant political weapon. It disarmed his enemies psychologically and showed the world that his rule wouldn't be like the bloody dictatorships of the past. It demonstrated a profound truth. In any long-term conflict, generosity can be a more powerful tool than cruelty. And yet, we can't ignore the immense cost of his ambition. His conquest of Gaul resulted in the death or enslavement of millions. His decision to start a civil war, however justified he felt it was, tore the Roman world apart. He achieved absolute power, but the price was the death of the republic he'd been raised to serve. His story is a timeless warning about the nature of power. It shows us that even the greatest of people, with the best of intentions, can be consumed by their own ambition. The very drive that makes someone great can also lead to destruction. Caesar got everything he ever wanted, but in the end, that power made him a target, and it cost him his life. So, what can we take away from this today? First, cultivate a bias for action. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Prepare diligently, but when the opportunity comes, act with boldness. Second, understand the power of generosity. In your own life, in your career, in your relationships, being the person who can forgive and offer a second chance is a source of immense strength and influence. And finally, be mindful of your ambition. Strive for greatness, but always ask yourself, at what cost? Caesar's life teaches us that the pursuit of power without an anchor in something greater than yourself, whether it's principle, community, or humanity, can lead to a victory that's ultimately hollow. That was a summary of Caesar, Life of a Colossus by Adrian Goldsworthy. We've walked through the major moments of his life today, but here's the thing. A summary can only ever be a map of the territory. The real adventure happens when you explore it for yourself. It's in the small details, the quiet moments of reflection, when a particular story or a simple phrase from the author hits you in a way you didn't expect. This podcast is here to help you decide if a book is worth your time and attention. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or resonated with you, I genuinely encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about leadership, ambition, and the timeless drama of human life. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and you want to continue exploring the ideas that have shaped the world's greatest minds, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Billionaire's Bookshelf. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.